Hi everyone, in this video I'm going to show how I did this drawing of a squirrel in graphite. Now when I am incorporating a background into the drawing, I do like to begin there. So here I'm simply using a triangular soft tool and I'm using graphite powder to get a layer of graphite in place. Now usually I do like to work with more of the round or the ovals, but in this situation this shape worked just as well. Now my main aim here is to cover the white of the paper. I didn't actually want any of that visible because I am later on going to add snow at the very end stage of this drawing. So starting off with this entire layer of graphite, I can then darken it from here. Now for backgrounds, I do like to use more of my graphite powder as much as I can before using pencils if I did need to define any of those layers. But because this background is out of focus, the graphite powder here worked from start to finish. Now when darkening up the graphite here, I do want to be making sure that I've got variety. I don't want the shapes to be symmetrical. I'm going for more of a blotchy effect. Now one tip when working with backgrounds is if there is a highlight on the subject that you do want to exaggerate or to have show up a little bit more, then darkening up the background behind that area is a great way to do that. Now there are a couple of times where I actually come back later on in the drawing process and make some of the sections of the background a little bit darker for that reason. Now if there is a light area of the background up against a light section of fur, then that fur is not going to actually show up in the way that we would like. Now in some situations that actually works quite well, but when we're working with an area that is an important structure, such as the shaping of the face, if that area of the face gets lost in that background, then it can actually make the face shape look different. So if I needed to make sure that I've captured that accurately, then darkening up the background around that area is certainly one way to do so. Now when starting on the squirrel, I always begin with the eye of any animal, and the eye shape here, the size of that eye is really quite small. So I only had space to add in the main highlight, the reflection, and then the darker colour of that eye. Now if I'm working larger, significantly bigger in this situation, then I would maybe have more space to add additional detail in the iris, if I could see it in the reference photo. But if that reference photo is overall very good quality, but the eye colour is quite dark, there's not too much detail there, then it's okay to draw it as it is. Forcing additional highlights there will change the light source, so we need to be making sure we're paying attention to that. Now when I start with the base layer, just like the background, I'm working with my graphite powder, but in this situation I'm using a paper blending stump to apply it. The reason being here, this area of course is far smaller than the background, so I wanted to have more control. Now what I'm doing at this stage is simply mapping in where the main placement is of my lights and my darks. I'm not overly worried at all about anything else, but the placement of the highlights and shadows helps to determine the underlying bone and muscular structure. So making sure that I've got these sections here in the right place is very important. You can see that as I'm starting to work more with my darker layers of graphite, that already the shape of the face is being established, yet there's no details or pencil work at all at this point. Now when I do start working with my pencils, for a small area here, I'm really focusing on the main fur directional changes. There won't be room to add all of them, but I can certainly add the ones that make the drawing look more realistic. Now one of the things here when aiming for realism that is crucial is values, more so than worrying about adding every single detail. Now here as I start to work with more of my additional darker layers of graphite pencil, you can see that I'm reinforcing my contrast with each layer that I add. Rather than jumping into the darkest pencil first for the shadows, I do like to build up my layers gradually. Now one of the things that this does is it helps to build softness within the fur, and this is something that I'm going to speak a lot more about when I work on the body. But certainly here, hinting at that fur directional change in combination with the placement of the highlights and shadows is something that I do pay very close attention to right from that base layer process. Now when the goal is to achieve realistic soft fur, I do feel that the base layer stage impacts that massively. Now one of the reasons for that is if I use graphite pencils here at this base layer foundation, then unless I'm using very cautious, light pressure, more shading techniques, it's going to have pencil strokes still visible. And I just feel that that actually extends this stage of the drawing process. Now, I can't stress enough that working with graphite pencils right from the beginning, no graphite powder here, it is more than achievable. But we do have to be allowing more time and more of that cautious approach just to make sure that the pencil strokes there aren't too harsh. Now, as I do start working with my graphite pencils, you can see that I'm focusing on the fur direction and I'm building up more of that gradual process yet again. So when I'm working with fur that I need to have more soft, the last thing I want to be doing is jumping into the top details. I really want to be making sure that I'm adding as many layers as I can to increase the depth and therefore the softness without losing too much of the layer underneath. Now, this is something that's more apparent when working on areas that are smaller. So if I add too many pencil strokes here, I will lose the lighter layer of graphite powder. So there are still many areas where that graphite foundation, the graphite powder layer, are still showing through. Now, this is going to make a big difference when I come back in with my erasers. If I'm not jumping into excessive pressure and dark pencils, then the erasers don't have to work so hard to pull in the highlights. Now, using erasers when working with graphite is one of the most common questions that I'm asked. How do we get the highlights to be visible? The erasers aren't working. Is there a problem? Is it the technique? Is it the eraser that I'm using? Now, all of these aspects of working with graphite I cover in my real-time version of these tutorials. If they are of interest, I'll link the information to those in the description below. But because I create those with a voiceover while I'm drawing, I'm able to explain everything in the moment. So even adjusting how we hold the pencil, the pressure that we should be applying, the tip of the pencil, how we should be moving the erasers, all of this is covered in those step-by-step lessons. Now, I find that drawing hands of any animal or person can actually be quite overwhelming. Now, the structures of the fingers in particular can actually change the shape very quickly, and then the hand doesn't look realistic at all. Now, one of the ways that I like to overcome that is by mapping in, again, my shadows and my highlights, exactly what I've mentioned when drawing the fur. You can see that as I'm starting to work more with my graphite pencils, I'm not focusing on detail. I'm just adding in the placement of the darker values, allowing the lighter layers to be my highlights, and slowly here the hand shape is taking more of that realistic shape and form. Now, if I was to work with a solid layer, jump into the details, try to then add my lights and my darks, I know that this area is going to look really confusing. I'm going to end up getting lost, I'm going to spend more time staring at my reference photo, and then the hand doesn't look anything like what it should do. So by taking one layer at a time, picking some of those areas that I know are accurate, such as some dark shadows, just means then that I'm more likely to be able to follow that reference photo more easily. Then before I know it, as I start to then progress through those layers, the hand has that realistic shaping right from the beginning. So as I continue on the rest of the body here, one of the aspects that's really important, which I have used and focused on throughout, is three main aspects of pencil technique. That's fur length, fur thickness, and fur direction. Now, I've mentioned fur direction, but the length of the pencil strokes here, it's also just as important. Now, of course, if that pencil is in contact with the paper for too long, that fur is going to end up looking longer than it should do. The animal might then look fluffier. It won't necessarily have as much definition of the body as it should. So at this stage here, I want to be making sure that not only am I focusing on the direction of that pencil, but also the length of that pencil stroke. Now, in some situations, an area of the fur on a specific part of the body might be slightly longer than elsewhere. For example, the body here, the fur is longer than that on the face. So I need to make sure that I'm adjusting my pencil strokes for each individual section that I'm working on. If the pencil strokes look the same from start to finish, then this is one aspect that can reduce that level of realism. It can make the fur look fake. It can also have a little bit more of that flatter two-dimensional feel. So as I'm then working with more of my layers, I'm focusing on the contrast, but the pencil technique here is also crucial. Now onto the tail, and I'm going to be incorporating everything that I've spoken up to this point, but the real difference with this fur texture is how dense the fur is. Now when recreating fur that is as thick as this, the layers here are crucial. Now just as I've mentioned, I'm going to be building up the layers gradually. I'm going to focus on the softness, but my first priority is trying to make sense of the main structures and the shape of the tail. Now this is one element that I can take out of that process of doubt. If I start to question the complexity of that fur, and it's also then made more exaggerated by the worry of the shape of the tail, then I'm having to do two things at once. If I focus on one or the other, it means then the other can then get more of that priority. Now this is something that I work with on any approach to simplify a reference photo. It might be mapping in a specific section of fur that stands out more so, but something there that then just simplifies that area of the reference photo. And as I say, for me, this was working on the outside edge first. Now the tail fur, this is where it is at its thickest, more of that dense fur texture. So when I'm working with my layers here, the softness becomes even more of a priority. If I don't have my softness, this section of the fur is going to look really rigid and flat. Now the dark pencil strokes are actually where the fur strand, some of that fur is clumped together and it's wet because of the snow. So here I really want to establish that. However, if I get too fixated on those darker clumps and I don't have my midtones in previous to that, then this fur again is going to look very flat. So everything here that I've spoken about in this video, it becomes more apparent. The length of my pencil strokes are significantly longer. The layers need to be built up more gradually. I'm working with a range of my erasers so that I can get my highlights established. However, when working with my erasers, I'll also darken them up as well, just to make sure that I've got my midtones. Now the midtones are crucial. They do really help with the softness. Sometimes the priority can be bright highlights and dark shadows and the midtones get forgotten about. But as I'm starting to work more with these layers of graphite pencils, you can see how the midtones here are working with the softness. Now there are many times where I will alter the layering of my erasers. At the moment I'm using my erasers far more frequently than I have on the body, and that's because this fur here, being how dense it is, it's got far more of those layers visible. So working with more graphite pencil layers, then switching over to the erasers, coming back in with my pencils is a really nice way to build the depth. Now as I continued with that layering approach, I'm then building up this softness as you can see, but at this stage I'm coming back in with my darker graphite and establishing more of that sharper contrast. Now one thing with these layers is to make sure that I didn't overdo it. I really enjoyed adding in this additional texture with this wet fur, but if it was then taken too far, I'd cover up those layers underneath and then lose the softness. This is where the balance of those techniques is really important. Now one other thing here is not all the time am I adding new darker strands of fur. Most of the time I'm actually darkening up what's already there that I established or mapped in at my base layer stage. This is the same when working with any fur texture. We might start with a section of fur because it stands out more so in that reference photo, but we don't necessarily mean then that we need to lose it as we build the layers on top. So coming back in throughout any point of that drawing and re-establishing those key areas can also mean that we're more likely to follow that reference photo more closely as we progress through those layers. Using those key points in a reference photo can really bring down that stress level, especially when working on something like this that's more challenging. So when I started working on the snowy branch here, just adding these final details, there was a lot of different techniques that were used to get to this point. So to make sure that I cover those more thoroughly, I'm going to actually create a separate video for YouTube that focuses just on this element. So that will be coming up in the next couple of weeks. But the final stages here, the last couple of minutes where I'm adding the snow, this is where it was really important to make sure that I had some kind of background in place so that these lighter snowflakes would then show up. So I do hope this video has been useful. If it was, I'd be very grateful if you could give it a like and a thumbs up. It makes a huge difference to my channel. I do upload a couple of videos to YouTube every week, so if you would like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. If you would like to draw along to the real-time version of this tutorial, then I'll link all of the information to that in the description below. If you have any art-related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments. I'm always happy to help if I can. And I'm going to be getting another video uploaded in the next few days. But as always, thank you so much for watching.